Part 3. The Ministry of Fate. They didn't just walk in. Although the mainframe computer in Colorado had been destroyed, there were hundreds of autonomous Terminators not under direct link command, still free to seek out human targets and eliminate them. Their internal power cells would keep them lethal for over 100 years. John realized that the casualties would continue to mount even after the war was won, until all the Terminators could be eliminated. They had to fight their way past a dozen wild-card Terminators into the complex. 3 hours later, the place had been cleared out. John's hand-picked sapper squad formed a protective phalanx for John and the tech team as they rode a huge freight elevator deep into the bowels of the building. They were tiny figures on the open platform that descended at a 45-degree angle into the concrete-lined tunnel, rapidly becoming a speck in the overscaled industrial landscape. Minutes later, the lift clanked to a stop, and the men stepped into a bizarre world designed by machines, for machines. The architecture was alien, without aesthetics, without even such human basics as doorknobs and lights. And yet, John was thinking with a thrumming in his chest, I've been here in my dreams many times. All my life I've tried to imagine what it would look like. Now I'm actually here. John led the uneasy men past statue-like Terminators, deactivated like the ones on the surface. Along the way they passed techs moving through the endless corridors with awe, stationing themselves like parasites in the guts of the now lifeless Skynet. When they passed John's team, they would grin as they saluted him, even though John wore no insignia of rank. Everyone knew him. He was one of the few commanders in all the wars that have been fought who truly earned his troops' respect as a man. When most of the survivors were cringing in the shadow of the colossus called Skynet, John Connor had stepped into the light with a pincer grenade and blasted the tracks of a rolling HK. Instead of darting back under cover, he stood in the flaming wreckage and siphoned off the unburned fuel to power his armored car. There was nothing John had asked his army to do that he had not already done, and more importantly, he knew with uncanny accuracy what had to be done. This created a loyalty and a trust that no machine could ever inspire. Even so, John was a hard man to get to know. Fuentes, who had fought alongside his commander for the last 5 years, felt the distance between them. They were comrades who could trust their lives to one another, but they were not exactly friends. John had been more charismatic and accessible years before, when he was first forming the army, building a relationship between himself and a growing legion of strangers. One got the impression his friendliness was part of the recruitment technique. Heartfelt, but expressed more out of necessity than desire. But when he was in his mid-20s, a personal tragedy caused him to withdraw even more into that grey prison of responsibility that had always been his. Fuentes had brought him the news. John had been crouched in a blast hole crater, giving final instructions to a squad of soldiers still in their teens. They were bright, eager, and dispensable. They would all later die in a diversionary battle that would lead to a major victory. As he watched them snake out into the moonlit ruins, Fuentes turned to John, struggling to remain calm as he gave his nightly field report. The supply convoy from Mexico had been ambushed by a squad of HKs. There were no survivors. John had listened, then only nodded. After all, this was simply one more defeat in a war filled with them. The supplies were important, but there were backups the army could use, and John had steeled himself to the loss over the years. People were always dying in this war, like the squad of teenagers John had just sent out on patrol. Even the horror of death could become routine if it happened often enough. All this Fuentes knew, and in normal circumstances, Fuentes would not have found John's reaction strange. When he wasn't needed, the general would often go off by himself to brood, especially after he had ordered hundreds of men into hopeless battle, just to buy time to build the army. But he would get over it quickly, eager to continue the struggle, driven by a certainty of their eventual victory. The loss of lives was necessary to achieve that victory. But Fuentes also knew what John knew. Sarah Connor had been leading that convoy. She had been ordered out of the action, but Sarah went her own way, and few people had the rank or the balls to stop her. Even John was in awe of her. Not only was she a superb combat soldier, she was also an expert tactician. But sooner or later, even the best soldier can be overwhelmed by superior firepower. As in this case. So Fuentes found it strange that John simply nodded when he told him his mother was dead. When the news became common knowledge, people who only knew and respected her by reputation would be weeping. Sarah Connor had been almost as legendary as her son. But all John did was thank Fuentes for the information and stride off. Later, Fuentes walked in on John, bent over his cot, sobbing. He quietly backed away, not wanting to intrude. It was the only time he had seen the great man cry. Since that time, John had never talked about his mother. It seemed his soul had seeped into the threads of his uniform. Fuentes loved John Connor, but he was not all that comfortable with him, and he certainly did not want to be him. When Fuentes looked closely, he could still see the sadness in John's eyes, as if the price of victory were too high, the wounds suffered far too deep to easily heal. In fact, the deeper they went into this place, the more depressed John seemed to get, as if there was something down here that he dreaded. Something terrible still to be done. They came to a huge open vault-like door. There was a bustle of hurried activity inside the vast chamber beyond. It was the size of a high school gym, comprised totally of incomprehensible machine surfaces. Techs knelt like priests in prayer before the altar of the machine god, inserting probes into the wafer circuit terminals, stacked like skyscrapers of thought throughout the enclosure. They were furiously downloading system files and cross-reffing the data with what had already been decoded, double-checking information John had already given them, had, oddly, already known. John and his men approached a busy hive of techs who had pulled up several floor panels and tapped directly into the cabling of the machine, using portable terminals they had wheeled in. Many of the soldiers in this war against machines were technical specialists, child geniuses who had gotten their education in bombed-out libraries and on the battlefield. Men who had not only had to think on their feet, but as they ran. John had gathered the best of them to break Skynet's machine code, read its thoughts and its plans, and analyze its data. Fighting fire with fire, John thought, as he proudly watched his techs moving with rapid assurance. It was one of the main reasons why they had won. Tech specialist Wynne looked up. He was a quivering reed of a man who had shown enormous stamina and intelligence in supervising the Chrono team. He nervously greeted John and told him they were almost ready. "Is he here?" John asked, a catch in his voice. Wynne nodded and indicated a group of techs at the far end of the room. A young soldier stood among them, being administered to as if he were royalty. John closed his eyes and held his emotions in check. It was Kyle Reese. John started walking towards him, feeling a resonant sense of déjà vu. His body seemed to become insubstantial, floating above a pool of grave sadness. He had yearned for this day of sweet victory, and dreaded it for the bitter sting of what he was about to do. Had to do. Kyle was finishing stripping off his battle uniform. The tech started smearing his body with a sour-smelling jelly. Fuentes wrinkled his nose. "What's that?" Wynne turned to him and answered, "It's conductance jelly, so the time field will follow his outline." Fuentes didn't know what the hell that meant, but then he didn't know what the hell this whole time travel angle was all about. John had tried to tell him, but it sounded like tech babble to him. Fuentes hated being here, surrounded by the machines he had fought so hard to defeat. He hated all machines, except the simple device slung over his shoulder. Weapons were the only good machines. He knew his hate was irrational. John had patiently told him machines were neither good nor bad. People were. Skynet had been built by men. Men who had been too terrified of each other to trust themselves with their own weapons. So they built a tool that simply carried out their paranoia to the nth degree. Okay. But Fuentes still wished they could get out of here. Up top, his squad was celebrating with homemade brew and the new cachet of canned food they'd liberated a few days ago. His woman was probably up there now too, waiting for him. John had said there was more work to do. Fuentes agreed. But it wasn't down here. It was up there, beside the warm fires of victory. But Fuentes, more than any man, had seen John's wisdom before and struggled to endure a growing claustrophobia. John was watching Kyle's face. It was so strange to look into the smooth face of a younger man and know that he was your father. Kyle was breathing deep and slow, showing supreme control, prepping for something they could never be prepared for: time travel. Only John could sense the utter terror behind Kyle's grim expression as a medtech hyped his arm, pumping his veins full of synthetic adrenaline, making his muscles pop out, combat ready. The techs moved aside, and suddenly John was beside Kyle. The two men looked at one another. They weren't friends. If there had been more time, perhaps they would have been, but John had only seen Kyle Reese 5 times before this day. And it wasn't until the second time they met that John heard his name and realized with a shock who Kyle really was. He hadn't said anything then, although John's mother had told him about his father and what was destined to be. He hadn't really wanted to accept it. In fact, for a time, John had rebelled against the whole idea of his destiny. Until the war came, that is, and the machines rose, and everything Sarah Connor had told him came heartbreakingly to pass. Each horrifying event like the tick of a cosmic clock pounding out history with blind cruelty. And now the clock was beating out what was, for him, the most cruel tick of them all. There was so much he wanted to say. But if he said one thing, he would have to say the rest. And there was no time. No purpose. It would only confuse Kyle when the soldier needed to be most focused. It was Kyle who finally spoke, awed in the presence of John Connor. "Did you know I'd be the one who'd volunteer?" John surprisingly nodded, forcing a smile of encouragement. "I've always known. Sarah told me." The young soldier's eyes went wide with astonishment. Kyle began to realize why his name was selected from the list over that of other, more experienced volunteers. Why, when he first told John his name, he had reacted so strangely. Kyle was somehow a part of history that hadn't happened yet, and John had always known. Maybe that was why he was moved to John's unit, why he was kept so close, and yet so distant. Once, Kyle had found himself beside his commander during an ambush. Impulsively, it seemed, John had reached into his blood-stained field jacket and handed over the faded, wrinkled picture of his mother. Then, without a word, he had lurched up to rally his troops. Kyle remembered gaping at the small, stained picture of Sarah Connor. Although many men carried her picture into battle to inspire them, they were cheap copies. This was the original. It was quite an honor to be singled out for, and a strange gesture from his commander, who never seemed to single anyone out, unless it was to decorate them. Since that time, John had hardly spoken to him, except to issue orders. It was almost as if he were avoiding him, yet trying to keep him close. For what? This? It must be. A fierce pride and excitement surged through Kyle. John asked, "They briefed you?" "Yes, sir. I know what to do, but I'm not sure why." John said, "You know what you need to accomplish the mission." Kyle stiffened. "Yes, sir." Then John did something that surprised Fuentes with its familiarity. He reached out, grabbing Kyle's shoulders in a firm, comradely grip. Kyle was all but overwhelmed. John added, "And you will succeed." It was said with such a terrible certainty. John seemed to collect himself and continued in a more dutiful tone. "Provided you do not let your guard down one single moment." "I won't, sir." "Did you memorize what I told you to tell her?" By the subtle shift in his commander's voice, Kyle understood this was very personal and extremely important. He took a breath and answered, "Every word, sir." John closed his eyes and turned away. Kyle caught a profound look of sadness overwhelming his commander's smile. It wasn't a look he was meant to see. It troubled him, but then Wynne approached and said, "Ready, Sergeant?" Kyle nodded and was led past several makeshift armoured barriers that had been carried into the time displacement generator's two enormous chrome rings, one inside the other, suspended over a circular hole in the centre of the floor, freely floating on humming magnetic fields. Kyle hesitantly stepped onto the first ring. It bobbed slightly under his weight. Then he carefully shifted onto the inner ring and looked into the hole, suppressing a gasp. Below him lay a vast echoing darkness. He looked back at John. His Messiah was waiting for him to step into the bottomless pit. John said, "Sometimes you have to put your faith in the machine." Kyle would put his faith in only one thing: his commander. The 19-year-old warrior inhaled, then stepped into open space. Everyone tensed. Astonished, Kyle looked down. He was walking on air, buoyed by an unseen field of force in the middle of the rings. Wynne turned to the techs and ordered them to begin the time displacement sequence. Several of them typed in coordinates on their portable terminals. Slowly, the rings began to rotate around each other on different axes, like some complex gyroscope. The humming of the force fields increased, and their tones began overlapping, creating weird harmonies. They all moved back as the floor opened like wedges in a pie that began to pour back from the center. The rings spun faster, suspended in space in the middle of the receding floor wedges. Then they began to descend, carrying Kyle with them. His eyes found John's again, and locked on them as he lowered into an unbelievably vast circular space. The time field generator. John approached the edge and watched him go until Kyle was a tiny figure. The rings were spinning so rapidly now they almost disappeared, becoming a sphere of whirling steel. The humming harmonies rose several pitches, howling out an unintentional melody that raised the hackles. Small electrical sparks started spitting out from the generator walls. John leaned over the edge, seemingly mesmerized. With a stab of alarm, Fuentes reached for him before he lost his center of gravity and toppled into the time machine. Lightning burst up from the generator and streaked across the room above the heads of the techs. Wynne ducked, smelling the strong odor of ozone. A huge charge of energy was building up. Everyone fell back behind the makeshift barriers and hastily put on their safety goggles. This was going to be big, and Kyle Reese was right in the middle of it. The chamber below had become a hell of energy with the young soldier at its center. The drone and the crackle of the generator built to a pounding thunder. John's heart was racing as fast as the rings. There was a rippling scream as if a god were being disemboweled. The room filled with hot white light. Without the goggles, they would have been blinded. When the glare faded, The floating rings were empty. They slowed to a stop, seared and smoking. In that endless instance of time displacement, Kyle Reese had vanished. Oddly, in its place was a sphere filled with whirling debris, crushed beer cans, faded yellow newspapers, dated 1984, and a slice of a dumpster filled with garbage from that year. Fuentes slowly lowered his goggles. Madre de Dios! Wynne cautiously approached the edge and looked down. Sparks sputtered and then died out. The debris settled. It works, Wynne said, excitedly, then continued. That space from 1984, it's been displaced, swapped with the space from now. John stepped up, removing his goggles, his eyes still readjusting to the lack of light. Fuentes asked him, Now what happens to Sergeant Reese, sir? I mean, what did happen? John's gaze seemed far away from this time and place. He accomplishes his mission and dies. Fuentes nodded. He is a good soldier. There was a dark, despairing expression in his eyes as John solemnly added, And my father. Fuentes stared in amazement. Now he knew what John had been dreading down here, and why John had not been able to fully appreciate their victory. The price was too high. John turned from the smoking chamber, seeming years older as his features drained, sagging. He put a hand on Fuentes' shoulder for support. Fuentes realized this was the first time he had seen his commander lose strength. He'd seen him tired, lonely, and haunted before, but not like this. He shouted an order in Spanish to the sapper team behind him. Set your charges! Let's blow this place back to hell! John struggled to recover, shaking his head. Not yet. There's one more thing we have to do. He turned to Wynne. What's your reading? Wynne glanced down at the palm-sized power meter dangling off his belt, looked up at John with a puzzled expression. Just like you said. John took a deep breath, feeling the wheels of destiny grinding near. Then, mustering his courage, he abruptly strode out of the room. Wynne started to follow. Fuentes frowned in confusion and hurried after, grabbing the tech's arm. What reading? What are you talking about? Wynne indicated the meter. This is the energy signal put out by the time displacement. I recorded 2 other identical pulses as we were fighting our way here. 2. Wynne impatiently continued, walking. Fuentes stayed with him. What are you talking about? The first must have been the Terminator going through to 1984. Fuentes was still confused. Yeah? Wynne careened into the corridor and quickened his pace to catch up with his commander. Fuentes dogged the tech. What was the second? Another Terminator, probably. John's footsteps clacked on the hard floor as he strode along the vaulted tunnel, followed by Fuentes and Wynne. They passed numerous galleries filled with hulking machines, now cold and motionless. A vast library of strategic technology that Skynet had designed and built. Even John's vaunted techs would need years to study it all. And once, having deciphered all the machine's functions, John would have to decide whether to destroy them, or trust that the new society rising up from the ashes could use them responsibly. He had no information to guide him in this, no memories of the past resonating with the future. On what happens after today, John didn't have a clue. But as he walked up to a massive steel door, the memories of the past flooded into his present. John knew he was looking at the door of fate. He knew that behind it he would find what he was looking for. The final answer to the question that had haunted him all his life. Was all of it true? even to the last. Wynne approached the door and patched into a control plate with a small probe. He punched out the coded sequence he had recovered from a damaged HK's internal terminal, then hurriedly stepped away. Locking bolts were electronically slammed back, and the door cracked open, accompanied by the hiss whoosh of a vacuum being filled. John stepped across the threshold, aimed his combat light at the far side of the room, then gaped. Fuentes and Wynne came up behind him, adding their lights to his. They were looking at a massive machine press that filled floor to ceiling. Still warm feeder pipes emerged from the walls and centered on the steaming press, forming a hub or a web. They walked underneath them to the place where the two 20-ton plates met and shined their lights into the small gap, large enough for a man to step into. There was an indentation in the shape of a man. John squinted at something gleaming at the edge of a small round opening positioned where the neck would be. He reached out with the tip of his rifle. The gleaming drop of what looked like mercury flowed effortlessly onto the metal of the barrel and seemed to soak in, disappearing. John pulled the barrel out so the others could aim their lights on the end. Fuentes scowled. "Where'd it go?" Wynne was studying the tip of John's gun, as if he were a man about to see God. He could discern a subtle lump, maybe only 2 millimeters higher than the original surface of the barrel, circumnavigating the barrel's circumference. "It's right there," Wynne said. "Where?" "It appears to have bonded to the barrel metal and mimicked it almost flawlessly. Amazing." The last fragment of uncertainty in John's mind was blasted away. It was time to make the last move in the chess game he had been unwillingly playing with Skynet for 15 long years. He knew a lot of what would happen, but past a certain point in his memory, he wasn't sure of the outcome. A knife embedded in a weathered picnic table with the words "No Fate" carved in them was the dividing line between what he knew had happened and what might happen. His very existence could be erased. Or maybe everything would still turn out the same. Or what? For the first time since he was a boy, John no longer had the answers. With growing apprehension, he handed the rifle to Wynne, took the probe, and abruptly walked across the room to a heavy steel door, covered with a thin sheet of melting ice. John punched out the code and waited. Ice shattered like glass as the door broke its seal and opened inward. He started to enter when Fuentes stepped in his way, rifle at the ready, and moved inside ahead of him, scanning the room for potential attack. His breath formed in front of him. They were in a cold storage room. Fuentes gasped as his beam fell on a row of naked bodies, hanging on steel racks suspended from the ceiling. John panned his light around. There were hundreds of men and women in rows of 10. Within each row, the bodies were absolutely identical. "Terminators," Fuentes whispered, his hand on his rifle, uneasy. John quickly walked along the synthetic bodies to the end of a row and hesitated. He scanned the faces. No, not here. Then he gazed down the other row. All the same. Strange to him. Then he turned to another row and stopped. It was filled with identical, familiar faces. The broad, brutally handsome features sent a shock of recognition through John. It was he. From so long ago and so far away, even before Judgment Day, when the world was halfway sane and bright with colour. John's eyes were burning with emotion. In a way, it was almost as bad as with Kyle. Fuentes stepped up, his gravelly voice snapping John back to the here and now. "I'm going to enjoy pushing the button on this place." Then he noticed John's expression. "What is it?" John faced the nearest, familiar Terminator. Its eyes were closed, but it was not sleeping. It was waiting. Then he turned to Fuentes with a cryptic answer, spoken in a hoarse whisper, the words coming from a man weary to the soul. The only problem with time travel is, it isn't over, even when it's over. John hurried back to Wynne, standing anxiously by the doorway. Fuentes watched John point to one of the racked Terminators and chatter a lot of tech babble for a few minutes, obviously agitated. None of this made any sense. They'd won. Hadn't they?